Three economists, Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James A. Robinson, share 2024 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. One among them, Professor Simon Johnson, is my guest this week. Simon Johnson is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he is head of the Global Economics and Management Group. In 2007-2008, he was chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, and he currently co-chairs the CFA Institute Systemic Risk Council. In February 2021, Johnson joined the board of directors of Fannie Mae. Professor Johnson, along with his colleague, has penned down many books. Some of his popular books are White House Burning, Jump-Starting America, 13 Bankers, and he recently co-authored another important book with Darren Acemoglu in 2023, which is titled Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. In today's program, we'll delve into that book. Professor Johnson, congratulations on being awarded Nobel for year 2024 in Economic Sciences, and I'm extremely delighted and honored to have you in my show. Welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sharma Samir.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be with you.
Professor Johnson, why did you and Darren Acemoglu felt a need to write a book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity?
Well, we feel that technology is once again at a key moment, a decision point, and the arrival of artificial intelligence provides us humans with an opportunity to enhance the productivity and the wages of everybody, including people without much education. But there is also the risk or the danger that AI primarily provides a way to automate jobs, replacing people with machines or algorithms in this case. And that would be very bad for many people. So which is it going to be? Will AI empower people and raise them up? Or will it, once again, like some previous technologies, undermine and hollow out the middle class?
Right. Professor, we seem to be living at a time where the narrative equating technological development with progress has been easily established. What's your take on this narrative?
Yeah, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the data. It's not what's in the history. Sometimes technological improvements boost productivity and lead to wage increases and shared prosperity. But in other instances, and we go through this in the book, including early in the Industrial Revolution, for example, and also the last 40 years in industrialized countries, better technology, meaning more productive machines, actually undermines the need for workers, reduces the demand for labor, and lowers wages for some segments, some big segments of the labor force. And that's a problem. That's a major problem for shared prosperity. So there is no, unfortunately, necessary link from more productive machines to shared prosperity.
So is the technological development that we are witnessing now in this point of time any different from the technological development we witnessed during the Industrial Revolution?
Well, every technological transformation is different. Obviously, this one is more focused on some white-collar tasks, office work, for example, some language-related work, some work that may have involved human interaction before, like customer service. Whereas early Industrial Revolution was mostly about replacing physical labor with machines. So we can say that this is somewhat more focused on mental labor. But I think there's an important element of commonality, which is you're replacing people with machines on the one hand, and on the other hand, you need to generate new tasks, new things for humans to do. And if you do that fast enough, and this is what happened after World War II, for example, in the US and in Europe, you have automation, but you create a lot of new work for labor, and the demand for labor goes up, its productivity goes up, and the wages go up. That's good. That's what you want. But after 1980 in the US, and early Industrial Revolution in Britain, for example, automation was very fast and new task creation was not so successful. And then the demand for labor does not increase anywhere near as much, it might even decline. And that's a problem for real wages.
Right. So one of the other argument that's sort of run parallels with what you have just said is that, this technological development also sort of enhances the productivity. So the whole idea of productivity seems to have, overpowered the whole narrative and thinking at this point of time.
Yes, I think that's right. And so let me take the example of a supermarket or grocery store in the US, where they now employ machines that are self-checkout machines. You actually see these in a lot of other countries as well, a lot of countries with lower wages than the US. So when you replace checkout people and staff with machines, what are you doing? You're transferring the work onto the customer. You don't pay the customer to do the checkout. You are raising average productivity, so fewer workers, same supermarket. You're not raising their marginal productivity. You're not raising how much that additional worker will contribute to the supermarket and how much you want to pay them. So as far as we can see, generally speaking, wages of workers in these grocery stores do not go up when they adopt these new self-checkout machines. Now, that's just one example, and it's an example we use because everybody sees it when they go shopping in the United States and other countries. But the same thing is true more generally. If you just bring in more machines and that's the only thing you do, you're firing workers. You don't need them anymore. And where are they going to go? What jobs are they going to have? In a country like the US, they can find work, but they find work at low skill levels and low wage levels. And that's what we call the hollowing out of the middle class.
Right. So that does mean that it will have a larger and long-term impact in the labor market and jobs with these technological developments.
Look, technological developments are incredibly important for what happens in the labor market. I mean, the two things are intertwined over, long enough period of time. The key point I would say is there's no necessary, forced, inevitable outcomes. It's all about choices. Who's developing the technology? Who's deploying the technology? What's their view of the world? What's their vision? These are of fundamental importance. And if we let artificial intelligence be developed just by a few guys, and they are men mostly, in big tech companies, mostly on the west coast of the United States, we will get their vision of what they think is important, which is not the vision of most people in the world. It's the vision of a very few people who already have a lot of money, some of them already billionaires. So it's distorted. It's their lens. It's incredibly influential because they decide what the technology should focus on and how to develop it further. And that's not what we should be doing.
Right. So, in this context, the democratic institutions look exhausted and is failing to deliver in many countries around the world, if we could see right now. Under that context, how do you foresee the future of democracy itself unfolding?
Well, I would agree that democracy is under pressure. There's no question. And it's under pressure because it has failed to deliver for many people over the past 4 decades. So let's use that as the starting point. But it hasn't failed. And alternative systems, authoritarian systems, generally give you worse outcomes because even if you have a good leader for a few years, they become isolated from the people, they become angry, they become old, and then there's a fight for power to take over. So authoritarian systems are not successful systems, with very, very few exceptions, and we'll see if those exceptions last. So democracies need to do better, and democracies need to focus on what we're saying, which is how to create more good jobs for more people. And that's important for the United States, and it's important for Europe, and it's important for many other countries around the world.
Yes. And unfortunately, the context seems to be suggesting that people are, moving away from these democratic practices and processes in not many countries, including in the industrialized West as well as in the this part of the world as well.
Well, again, I think there's pressure, and there are big voices wanting to move away. Donald Trump is one example. But it hasn't happened yet. So we have an election in November that'll be very consequential. And then there's a question of who accepts the election result, for example. That will also matter a great deal. So there is a challenge to institutions of a kind we have not seen for probably close to 100 years. But it's not over. And the process of securing democracy and building democracy is never smooth. It's always been a fight, because powerful people do not like to give up that power or accept constraints on that power. So, I just take this to mean that we have to keep working, and you have to make sure that democracy functions properly and that it delivers real benefits to as many people as possible.
Right. So, Simon, is it because the democracy is under pressure because the former liberal framework is failed to deliver to the expectations of that people would have wanted to, or is it the historical sort of cycle that every system passed through? What is, from the historical perspective, what would you say through that?
Well, I think in industrialized countries where we understand this process best because we have more data, we can see three things at work. Automation, which I talked about, but particularly the effect of computers from the 1980s, digital revolution, digital transformation, globalization, increased trade and capital flows, and the decline of trade unions. Those three, it's that combination that has really undermined the middle class and contributed to widening income inequalities. My colleague and co-winner Doron Acemoglu and I run a research center at MIT with David Autor. David Autor is one of the world's most famous labor economists. And David, and so we study these issues, and we're trying to understand the texture of what happens and make relevant policy proposals. David has a very famous chart that shows what happens to real wages of men, for example. With a lot of educations from the 1960s, their wages go up. People with little education in the US actually don't show any increase in real weekly earnings since the 1960s.
Wow.
Right? That's an incredible failure. Yeah, that's an incredible failure to deliver. Now, in other economies, there are other stories. In some places, it's about corruption. In some places, the government overreach. In some places, sure, yes, there was a liberal, a set of free market policy proposals that were not very helpful. But in general, I think the structure, it's the structure of the global economy and these global dynamics, which are big, right? They're big processes, but they're not irresistible. You can push in the other direction if you understand what you're up against.
Right, right. And can you please explain the relationship between poor rule of law in societies and institutions that exploit the population, do not generate growth or change for the better?
Yes, I mean, this is unfortunately what we see in lots of countries, and it's an important part of the legacy of European colonialism in many places, which is, so I'll focus on the colonial countries. It's not the only places. They're not the only place with this problem. But when the Europeans showed up and when they wanted to extract resources, or they wanted to run the slave trade, or they wanted just to take taxes off the system and not make any investments, they used various kinds of extractive arrangements. Now, those arrangements differed by country. Lakshmi Iyer has done very good work on this in India, for example. Melissa Dell has really dug into this in Peru. So there's different stories and different landscapes of extraction in different places. But the problem is that when the colonial authorities left, local elites stepped in and in many cases either took over the exact instruments of extraction, or they found some new mix and match combination.
Right.
But the result is that places that were highly extractive under European colonialism, many of them have remained or become highly extractive after independence. Now, again, it's a choice, right? But it's a choice that's rooted in the power of the elites and the fact that that's how they want to enrich themselves. And it's difficult. It's difficult to change that. I have to admit, it's very difficult.
Right. And, looking in our own context, in a lot of societies in South Asia, I would say corruption have also kind of sort of ensured or hampered economic growth.
Corruption is pernicious. It's very dangerous and damaging to economic growth. And I think even a little bit of corruption is bad, and a little bit of corruption very quickly becomes big corruption, and that very quickly becomes no more rule of law, no more protection of property rights, no return on investment for the people actually making the investment and risking their capital, and that destroys enterprise and discourages savings, and I think that is a recipe for prolonged, deep economic disaster.
Right. In the last 30, 40 years, there's a lot been, debate around the poverty, suggesting that, the poverty has really gone down globally. But inequality seems to be growing in many parts of the world. How do you foresee the future of inequality itself?
Well, as I said before, I think it depends on how we develop and deploy technology. If technology enhances productivity of people lower in the social scale, and if they can acquire enough bargaining power through trade unions or other mechanisms, then they can have higher wages, then we have more shared prosperity and we have presumably reduced inequality. But if technology empowers and enables a few people at the top, for example, to run more intrusive surveillance systems, to keep the workers suppressed and down, then more of the gains will go to the people at the top, and inequality will worsen. So once again, we're at a crossroads, and it depends on the choices that we make.
Right, right. And do you feel, Johnson, that these kind of historical junctures or crossroads we have faced in the past as well? Is it fundamentally different from those kind of crossroads that had already come and went, or is it entirely different?
Well, again, the specifics are different because the technology is different. It's very digital. It's very much about jobs and work around data, the organization of data, the presentation of data, and of course everything to do with the internet, because it's fully digital. But I think there's a big common element. I think that we are absolutely once again confronting the issue of, do you let elites dominate the technology, and if you do, what do they produce? And that turns out to be not so good for most people. And then what are the mechanisms through which there can be a broader set of people at the table, more voices, more pressure to push the technology towards things that are genuinely useful to people with less opportunity and less education.
Right. And how do you see, state as political institutions evolving in the digital age? Do you think they can manage the disruptions brought forth by today's technological development?
Well, that's a great question, and it remains to be seen. Obviously, it's very early days. We do worry a lot that the state or some states will use the technology not to empower people, but to monitor them. So the rise of the surveillance state, which is, we have a version of that in the United States and other industrialized countries already, but that could become much worse. And if you partner that with surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff's expression, which is very, very compelling, then big companies, and maybe medium-sized companies, will be surveilling, monitoring, and effectively suppressing their workers. So that would be a pretty bad combination.
Right. And the labor movement, civil society movements, the former traditional media also seem to be losing legitimacy as they much further speed. What do you think? Can they reclaim their space? And if yes, how can they do it?
Well, I think the media can develop in different directions, and we should be taxing digital advertising, which is very dangerous, damaging to people's health because it grabs their attention and causes a form of addiction, and it's very, very dangerous to children, very harmful to children. So I think business models need to be pushed in a different way, and we should use taxation to do that. I think the question about the labor movement is very important, and we're not seeing a resurgence in the US. We are seeing some stabilization of it. And of course, other countries have stronger labor traditions, organized labor traditions in the US. But it's hard to find an alternative. If you have a lot of workers and they're not organized, they're not going to have a lot of bargaining power compared to big capital. And so when productivity gains do occur, because you have better machines, it's very hard for the workers to capture any part of those productivity gains. So let me tell you this. If you look at the data on wages of low-skilled workers in China, they do not move much from the late 1980s until the 2010s. And that's a period of which we have quite good data. And then the data end. And I understand if you try to publish those data or share data on this in China, you get into big trouble with the authorities. So you have to then ask the question, if it's the case that low-skilled workers are gaining in China and sharing in prosperity, why do they not want that data to be published?
Right. You have discussed how technology can either concentrate or diffuse power. In today's global economy, how can we ensure that technological innovations decentralize power rather than reinforcing monopolies?
Look, I think the key is for countries around the world to band together and to form buying coalitions, because what gets the attention of capitalists is market opportunity. And if you go to them and say, look, we're Nepal, we're a relatively small country, we'd like you to develop this or that, you're not going to even get a meeting, I think. But if you say, we've brought together 1 billion people, 1 billion farmers, and we need the following, and we've talked to the farmers, we've studied the farmers, understand the farmers, and this is what we need, and this is what we will buy, and here is our, in the jargon, people call it pre-market commitment. So this is what we will buy if you invent it. If you don't invent it, we're not going to buy it, obviously, right? So that's interesting. 1 billion consumers will buy my product. They'll commit to buy it. Oh, now you have my attention, right? And so I think while the power is with these US tech companies, and we should recognize that, I do not think it's a good idea to sit back and say, oh my goodness, it's out of my hands. I have no agency. This is hopeless. No, this is 2024. We've learned a lot about the history of technology. We know about colonial legacies. We know the danger of having a few people in a faraway capital decide the fate of nations. We don't want that. You don't want that. I don't want that. We don't need to have that. Let's not have that. So let's get serious and say, where's the market? Who's got the money? How do we pool? So the United States is 335 million people, roughly. Very innovative society, maybe the most innovative in the world, in world history. In the world, we have about 8 billion people. So I say to my American audiences, let's get out and help people solve their problems. And that doesn't mean the Americans will come and do it for you. That you don't want, right? We've seen that one as well. What it means is they work with you and they help you. They come to you and understand your problem and then help you link up with technology. And this is what we do at MIT, by the way. I started a course at MIT where students do this in projects with companies and entrepreneurs around the world at all income levels. And over the past 25 years, 2,500 students have taken this course, which requires them to spend a whole semester working with companies outside the US and then 3 weeks in January on the ground. And at the end of that, and I say to them, my goal in this course is not for you to have the best business school experience or even the best education experience. It's the best life experience you ever had. And many of them come back to me and say, oh my goodness, I saw the world through someone else's eyes because I spent all this time and I invested in this relationship. And instead of me looking down from the US, I was looking up from Jakarta or Rio de Janeiro or somewhere. And we were helpful and we had some ideas and we brought some pieces and, we learned something. We said, by the way, in Ecuador, they do it this way. Have you considered doing this in Vietnam? They're like, oh, no, we haven't. That's interesting. How would that work? Right? So this kind of individual to individual spark and sharing is very powerful and it works, but it needs to be a partnership. It can't be dictated. It can't be top down. That's arrogant and foolish and it's not going to work.
Right. Simon, you have, I think, work in most of the Eastern Bloc in Eastern societies in the past. But how do you see, the societies like most of the societies, like, say, for example, Nepal itself would evolve in future that's kind of exposed to modernity at the same time to the digitized world at the same time, scrambling or trying to grapple and fix the institutions, its political instability. Where do you see this kind of societies heading towards?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know is the honest answer. When I was at the IMF, and I was the chief economist there, as you mentioned, 2007, 2008, the IMF tries to tell countries what to do, sometimes with good intentions, great people at the IMF, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. I don't do that anymore. What I say is, you tell me the path that you want, and I will help you think through what we know about that path, what the alternatives are, and what your choices are, and you make those choices. So Japan, as you surely know, at the end of the 19th century, when they decided to modernize in a hurry, which they did, they went shopping around the world and they looked at different arrangements. Look at the police, look at the army, look at the navy, look at railways, and they did a mix and match in terms of what they took from different places, parts of the world, and they chose what they wanted. And I think everyone should choose their own path and their own mix and match. But it's still useful to have conversations, shared expertise, a lot of on the ground, back and forth. Okay, we can do this, we can't do that. And I think that the piece we need to add to that is this, as I was mentioning, this prioritization of technology that's genuinely appropriate to different contexts. And the only way you'll get that is if you can present a market in a capitalist world, okay, which is what we live in. You need to present a market opportunity that really catches the attention and it looks interesting and people will go after it. And you can do it through a non-profit framework, of course. You can appeal to people's, good intentions, but nothing scales and delivers like monetary opportunity. I mean, that's the reality, right? So doesn't mean that it's evil, doesn't mean that it has to crush people, doesn't mean that it has to destroy existing culture. No, on the contrary, I think you should figure out how to tap into those things and use those tools to your own purposes.
Right. A slightly different context, but I am pretty interested in exploring this with you as well. So what is your view on societies that do not reflect on its own history, and how should we approach history?
That is, I think, the biggest question of the day. Because if I can change your mind about the history of your country and your people and your community, I can change your view of modern realities and current choices, and I can change the trajectory of everything in the future. So we fight about history a lot in the United States. We fight to control textbooks. We fight about the legitimacy of stories. We fight about slavery and what slavery was and was not. And these are not inconsequential fights. They are existential fights. They are fights to control and to change people's understanding. And I think there is a truth. There was a thing that happened. There is a history, a unique history. But to find that and to establish that and to persuade people of that is very difficult. Because you and I will walk away from this meeting with a different understanding and a different memory, and someone else can come and look at the tape of this conversation and put their own interpretation on it. And even with the best intentions, we can diverge considerably. So I think what you need to do is study history, argue history, and fight about history every day. And never believe that a certain historical picture has been established, because you find people who will appear year after year with crazy ideas and dangerous ideas based on some strange view of history. But it's a lot of work, and I have nothing but admiration for people who study history professionally, and people who guard and manage libraries. Librarians in the United States are under enormous pressure, in part because of the history angle, but also the question of the presentation of the history and the presentation of the culture. And I think those people are incredible and super important and should be valued much, much more than that.
Right. The other day, I had an opportunity to interact with, the Professor David Christian from Australia, who he used to run this huge project called The Big History, wherein it seems a lot of the other disciplines he has brought together to understand the thread of human evolution as such. It looks like the whole, the learnings and social sciences seems to be coming together to understand the past, which is equally important, I guess.
The reaction of one person to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was, this was a British upper class lady. She said something along the lines of, "Let us hope it is not true, and if it is true, let us hope it does not become widely known."
Oh, wow!
Right.
Quite interesting.
Yeah. Look. So the pursuit of truth is a never-ending saga, and I think the only way you get to truth, or close to truth, in a historical sense, is by arguing. Argue it out, cards on the table, in a polite way, and not screaming at each other. That's very unproductive. But actually, what are your facts? What are my facts? Where did this come from? Whose authority do you have this on? What was that? What was the lens of the person telling this story? Why did they see it this way? It's elusive. But it's also fascinating. And if you do it right, it's compelling.
Right. Simon, my last question. What do you hope to see in the next chapter of the technological and economic narrative?
Well, we call it Pro Worker AI, and we have a baseball cap. And if you give me your address, we'll send a baseball cap. As long as you give me a picture, a photograph from Nepal of you wearing the cap, that's a good trade. Because Pro Worker AI means literally and really harnessing the power and the potential of AI to help ordinary workers have better, more meaningful, and higher paid jobs. That's what I want to see.
Simon, on that note, I'd really like to thank you for your time, and I'm really honored that you decided to be a part of my show. Thank you so much from my program to you.
Well, thank you for reaching out when you did, and it's a delight and a pleasure to meet with you. And I will tell people around the world how well informed you are, and how fantastic this conversation has been.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.